Up until the mid-19th century, a majority of Americans were part of an agrarian republic made of small, self-sufficient farmers who did not have to rely on others or markets to survive. This all changed during the Industrial Revolution, which destroyed the autonomy of these free men and forced them into a new system that workers referred to as wage slavery. The most important Enlightenment figure to champion the idea of free Republican men was Thomas Jefferson, who acquired the Louisiana Territory, at least in part, to make sure every white man in America could have his own farm relying on only himself, his friends, and his family to survive, thus participating in a nation of free people. And for a while, it worked. But in the 19th century, new innovations changed the economic and political landscape, the most important of which was the factory. The factory was an organizational innovation that gathered laborers who used to work from home into one place and split up tasks among them, making production much more efficient. These artisans and factory girls saw renting yourself to an employer as not very different from chattel slavery and considered it an attack on their dignity. Laborers were used to working freely for themselves and retaining the full value of the wealth they created. But in the factory, they worked on external command, and most of the value they produced was given to the factory owners. The working class press wrote, "When you sell your product, you retain your person, but when you sell your labor, you sell yourself, losing the rights of free men and becoming vassals of mammoth establishments of moneyed aristocracy that threatens annihilation to any that question their right to enslave and repress." The artisans and factory girls despised the industrial system, seeing it destroy their independence, culture, and forcing them to leave their families to enrich others. The workers advocated for worker-run businesses. The common view at the time was that those who work in the mills ought to own them, and that liberty was not the ability to choose between masters, but to actually own, control, and benefit from one's own labor. It was during the advent of the factory that the great wealth disparity in America began. The new captains of industry began enriching themselves at the expense of those doing the actual work, and the government protected these businesses, issuing bonds, distributing land grants, and providing legal protection. Independent farmers couldn't compete with these factories or corporations and were eventually forced to either work for wages or set out for the territories where they could retain their autonomy. To escape the wage system, there was a massive exodus from the East Coast between 1790 and 1840 as 4.5 million Americans crossed the Appalachian Mountains. Free laborers weren't the only people opposed to northern mercenary capitalism. Proponents of slavery actually made the argument that chattel slavery was more moral than wage slavery. They thought the capitalists in the North ruthlessly exploited their workers, paying them barely enough to survive and discarding them when they were too old or ill to be of any use, leaving them to the ravages of the free market. A 19th century labor organizer wrote, "Wages is a cunning device of the devil for the benefit of tender consciousness, who would retain all the advantages of the slave system without the expense, trouble, or odium of being slaveholders." As it turns out, many agreed, including the newly formed Republican Party, who framed itself as the party against chattel and wage slavery. Abraham Lincoln even stated in his first congressional address to Congress, "A few men own capital, and that few avoid labor themselves. Labor is prior to and independent of capital. Capital is only the fruit of labor and could never exist if labor had not first existed. Labor is the superior of capital and deserves much higher consideration." But after the Civil War, the East Coast bankers, railroad barons, and land speculators extended their reach to the territories. With their idle capital and government protection, the factories were so efficient that the wealth was so unevenly distributed that for the first time, people couldn't find work. And in 1869, the government created a new metric on the census: unemployment. Though formally free, these workers were nonetheless economically dependent on others to hire them. While the worker appears to be his own man, he was bound to the capitalist class, allowing him only the freedom to choose between masters or the freedom to starve. Perhaps you find it offensive to African slaves who were once seen as property to have free white men in a market system refer to themselves as wage slaves. But upon his emancipation and entry into the northern capitalist system, former slave Frederick Douglass said, Experience demonstrates there may be 13 wages of slavery, only a little less galling and crushing in its effects on that of chattel slavery, and that this slavery of wages should go down with the other. However, it did not, and people of the post-Civil War economy found themselves with much less freedom than they had a generation ago, working more for less. In fact, this trend continued until the present day. Today, an average American wage earner works 24% or 2 months longer per year than a 14th century peasant in feudal Europe. By allowing the capitalist class to keep the majority of wealth produced, historian Norman Ware mentioned that the wealthy, under this new system, created an artificial scarcity to keep us in a humble state of dependence. This idea that someone's work was dictated by a clock on the whims of an employer to produce things they didn't own was in stark contrast to Jeffersonian democracy and the idea of American republicanism. Jefferson saw laborers who depended on another for wages as unfree and thus not real Americans. The contemporary concept that work is a burden comes out of capitalist ideology. Free, creative work, especially if it serves a social purpose, under the control of its producer, is the highest form of human inquiry and creativity. It is when people are driven to needlessly labor in order to enrich the few at the expense of the many that work loses meaning and becomes a burden. In the 1970s, writer Charles Bukowski said, "How the hell can a man enjoy being awakened at 6:30 a.m. by an alarm clock, leap out of bed, dress, force feed, shit, piss, brush teeth and hair, and fight traffic to get to a place where, essentially, you make lots of money for someone else and are asked to be grateful for the opportunity to do so?" Thanks for watching.